In 1963, a man walked into a boardroom in Chicago carrying the strangest bicycle anyone in the room had ever seen. The handlebars reached up like the horns of a bull. The seat looked like a banana. The executives took one look at it and laughed. Within 18 months, that bicycle and the machines it inspired would dominate American bike sales. It would become the best-selling bicycle in the history of the most powerful bicycle company on Earth. A company so dominant that for decades, 1 out of every 4 bicycles sold in America carried its name: Schwinn. If you grew up in America, you didn't just know this brand, you wanted it, you begged for it, and if Christmas morning brought you anything else, you remember the disappointment to this day. Which is why what happened next makes no sense. Because on October 7th, 1992, the Schwinn Bicycle Company, the empire that had ruled American childhood for nearly a century, filed for bankruptcy. $82 million in debt. And when the lawyers finished carving up the remains, the family that built it all walked away with barely $2.5 million. Here's the part almost nobody knows. Schwinn wasn't murdered by foreign competition. Schwinn trained its own replacement, personally, deliberately. And by the time anyone inside the company understood what they had done, it was already too late. This is the story of how America's bicycle died, and it begins with a man crossing an ocean. In 1891, a 31-year-old machinist named Ignaz Schwinn stepped off a boat from Germany. Back home, he had helped design bicycles for other men and watched them take the credit. He came to America for one reason: control. He wanted to build bicycles his way, under his own name, answering to no one.
Remember that word: control. Because the same obsession that built this empire is the thing that would one day destroy it. Ignaz landed in the perfect city at the perfect moment. Chicago in the 1890s was the bicycle capital of the world. 30 factories were hammering out thousands of bikes a day. By 1897, 1 out of every 7 people in Chicago owned a bicycle. America was in the grip of a full-blown craze, and everyone wanted in. In 1895, Ignaz found his money man, Adolf Arnold, a German-born meatpacker who had made a fortune in the stockyards. Together, they founded Arnold, Schwinn and Company, one of roughly 300 bicycle makers fighting for survival in America. 300 companies. Within a few years, almost all of them would be gone. The bicycle craze collapsed as fast as it began. The automobile was coming, and the market drowned in cheap, disposable bikes. Factories closed by the dozen. In Chicago, only 12 makers survived. Ignaz Schwinn was one of them. And he didn't just survive. He went hunting. He'd bought up failing competitors, built a massive modern factory on Chicago's west side, and by 1908, he had bought out Arnold himself. The company now belonged to one family. And it would stay that way, for better and for worse, for almost a century. Then Ignaz did something unexpected. He bet the company on motorcycles. Schwinn bought Excelsior, then Henderson, and by 1928, his motorcycle division was the 3rd largest in America. Only Indian and Harley-Davidson stood above it. The future looked unstoppable. Then came October 1929. The stock market crash gutted the American motorcycle industry almost overnight. By 1931, Excelsior Henderson was dead, and Arnold, Schwinn and Company was staring into the abyss of bankruptcy.
The empire was one bad season away from disappearing before most Americans had ever owned a Schwinn. The company was saved by the founder's son, and he saved it with a piece of rubber. Frank W. Schwinn took over day-to-day operations with a simple conviction. In the middle of the Great Depression, when every competitor was making bicycles cheaper and flimsier, Schwinn would do the opposite. In 1933, he introduced an American bicycle built around fat, cushioned balloon tires, wrapped in the styling of a motorcycle. Kids didn't see a bicycle, they saw a machine. It worked. The balloon tire became the standard for the entire American industry, and Schwinn became the name that meant quality. Frank walked the factory floor and knew his workers by name. There were no detailed contracts because there didn't need to be. Schwinn took care of its people. That trust would last for decades, and then it would shatter in a single vote. But we're not there yet. Through the 40s and 50s, the empire reached full power.
The Black Phantom of 1949, all chrome and springs and gleaming paint, became the bicycle of the American dream. Schwinn stopped making bicycles for department stores to slap their own labels on and sold only under its own name through its own trusted dealers. A Schwinn wasn't a toy anymore. It was a rite of passage. At its height, Schwinn was building more than 1 million bicycles a year. For decades, at least 1 in 4 bikes sold in America was a Schwinn. No brand before or since has owned American childhood so completely. And then, in 1962, a salesman in California noticed something strange. Kids in Los Angeles were butchering their bicycles.
Ripping off the seats and handlebars, bolting on long banana saddles and towering ape-hanger bars, transforming ordinary 20-inch bikes into miniature choppers. It looked ridiculous. It looked dangerous. It looked exactly like something no respectable company should touch. Word reached a man in Chicago named Al Fritz, and Al Fritz was not a typical executive. Fritz had started at Schwinn as a welder. The story goes that he heard about a secretarial job in the front office, washed his hands, walked in wearing his leather apron and steel-toed boots, typed a flawless letter, and got hired on the spot. By the early 60s, he was running research and development. When he heard what the California kids were doing, he flew out, took one look, and understood something everyone else had missed. The kids weren't ruining bicycles. They were telling the industry exactly what they wanted, and nobody was listening. Fritz came home and built a prototype: banana seat, high-rise handlebars, 20-inch wheels. When he presented it, Schwinn's management thought the idea was a joke. Some of them laughed at it openly. They stopped laughing very quickly. Introduced in mid-1963 and named the Stingray, riding the fame of Chevrolet's new Corvette, the strange little bicycle sold more than 45,000 units in a matter of months. The only thing that stopped Schwinn from selling more was that America physically ran out of the tires it needed. By the end of 1964, high-rise bikes had conquered American bike sales, and Schwinn owned the category it had invented. In 5 years, Schwinn sold nearly 2 million Stingrays. Then came the legendary Krates: the apple crate, the orange crate, the lemon peeler, small front wheel, stick shift, slick rear tire.
For a generation of American kids, a crate wasn't a bicycle. It was a Ferrari you could actually own. This was the peak, the absolute summit of the American bicycle empire. And it's exactly here, at the moment of total victory, that the seeds of the collapse were quietly planted. Because behind the gleaming showrooms, the factory that built the empire was growing old. The great Schwinn plant on Chicago's west side had been state-of-the-art in 1905. By the 1970s, it was an aging maze of outdated machinery, built to weld heavy carbon steel in an industry that was moving to lightweight alloys. The equipment couldn't handle the new materials. The systems for tracking parts and inventory were ancient. Then, in the early 70s, America went bicycle crazy one more time: the Great Bike Boom. Demand for 10-speeds doubled almost overnight, and adults, not just children, flooded into the stores. It should have been the greatest gift in Schwinn's history. Instead, it exposed everything. The old Chicago factory simply could not build bikes fast enough. So Schwinn made a decision that seemed harmless. Quietly, it began ordering bicycles from Japan: Panasonic, Bridgestone. The bikes were excellent, in some ways better than what Chicago could produce. And because they carried the Schwinn name, millions of Americans who would never have trusted a Japanese bicycle bought one without a second thought. Schwinn had just taught its own customers that a Schwinn didn't have to be made by Schwinn. Remember that, because the company was about to teach that same lesson to someone far more dangerous. Inside the family, everyone knew the real answer: build a new factory, modern equipment, modern materials, a fresh start. In 1978, a plan was on the table for exactly that. But a new plant meant outside money, outside investors, shared control. And control was the one thing this family would never give up. The board said no. The money kept flowing instead to dividends for the family trust. The 80-year-old factory would have to keep going. 1 year later, in October 1979, a fourth-generation heir named Edward Schwinn Jr. took over the company. He was in his early 30s. And according to the reporters who later documented the collapse, he would go on to alienate nearly everyone the company depended on: workers, dealers, lenders, suppliers, even his own relatives. The first explosion came almost immediately. The men and women on the factory floor were no longer the workforce of Frank W. Schwinn's day, and the old family trust between management and labor had been eroding for years. Wages were falling behind inflation, job security was vanishing. In late 1980, the Chicago workers did something that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. They voted to join the United Auto Workers. The family took it as a betrayal. When the new union came to negotiate, management stonewalled. In September 1980, 1,400 assembly workers walked off the job. The strike lasted 13 weeks through a bitter Chicago winter. When it finally ended, the workers had won only modest gains. And then came the real answer.
Only about 65% of them were ever called back to work. Because during those 13 weeks, while the picket lines stood in the cold, Schwinn's management had been solving its production problem another way, on the other side of the Pacific. There was a small bicycle manufacturer in Taiwan that was desperate to build bikes for the most famous name in the industry. Its name was Giant. Schwinn began shifting production there, and Giant delivered. Low cost, high quality, no unions, no strikes, no aging factory. But Giant didn't just build Schwinn's bicycles. It absorbed Schwinn's knowledge, specifications, quality standards, engineering, decades of accumulated know-how transferred piece by piece from Chicago to Taiwan. Schwinn was training the company that would replace it, and it was paying for the privilege. In 1983, the axe finally fell. The great factory on Chicago's west side, the plant that had built the Phantoms and the Stingrays and the Krates, the place where Al Fritz had once worked as a welder, closed its doors forever. The last bicycles rolled out that summer. Nearly 80 years of American manufacturing, gone. The authors who chronicled the collapse called it a Pyrrhic victory over the union. The family had beaten its own workers, and in doing so, it had cut its own throat. The closure devastated the company's finances. In 1980, Schwinn's net worth was nearly $44 million. By 1983, it was under $3 million. Schwinn did try to keep building in America, one last time, a brand new plant in Greenville, Mississippi, chosen in no small part because Mississippi was about as far from a labor union as you could get. But it was also far from everything else, far from headquarters, far from suppliers,
Far from the ports where Asian parts arrived, far from any trained industrial workforce. The Greenville plant never made a profit, not one single year. Meanwhile, the industry was transforming again, and this time Schwinn wasn't just late, it was absent. Out in California, riders were bombing down mountainsides on fat-tired machines, and small, hungry companies like Trek, Specialized, and Cannondale were turning the mountain bike into the future of the entire industry. Schwinn's first response was to bolt knobby tires onto a heavy old road bike and call it new. The kids who had once begged for Stingrays were now adults, and they were buying Treks. Here's the bitter irony. In these years, the thing keeping Schwinn alive wasn't really bicycles at all. It was an exercise machine, the Airdyne, a stationary bike with high margins that quietly bankrolled the entire company. And who had championed it? Al Fritz. The welder who saved Schwinn in 1963 was saving it again 20 years later. He retired in 1985. Within a few years, Sears cloned the Airdyne, sold it cheaper, and that lifeline snapped too. By the end of the 80s, the walls were closing in. Unsold imported bikes piled up in warehouses. A bicycle venture in Hungary burned millions. The company owed enormous sums to its Asian suppliers and couldn't pay. And those suppliers were no longer just suppliers. Giant was now selling excellent bicycles under its own name, in Schwinn's own market, sometimes through Schwinn's own former dealers. The student. After nearly a century, no Schwinn bicycle would ever be built in America again. The end came quickly now, loss after loss, lenders pulling credit lines, dealers defecting to Trek, $30 million owed to Giant and China Bicycle alone. On October 7, 1992, the Schwinn Bicycle Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in Chicago, the city where Ignaz Schwinn had stepped off the boat 101 years earlier. What happened in the bankruptcy was, in its way, the cruelest chapter of all. The vultures circled,
and the company was sold off to an investment fund led by a man Chicago called the Grave Dancer. The lawyers and creditors fought over the carcass, and when the deal was done, the Schwinn family trust, the heirs to a century of American manufacturing, received about $2.5 million, roughly the price of a nice house in the suburbs, for one of the greatest brand names America ever produced. There is one last detail. One of the great-grandsons, Richard Schwinn, refused to walk away from bicycles. He bought back the small Wisconsin workshop where the company's legendary hand-built racing frames had been made, and kept building them, beautifully, to this day. But under the terms of the deal, he was forbidden from putting his own family name on them. Think about that. A Schwinn, legally barred from building a Schwinn. The name itself never died. That's the strange epilogue to this story. The brand passed from one owner to the next, went bankrupt a second time in 2001, and was bought at auction by a mass-market bicycle company. Today, you can still buy a brand new Schwinn. It's made in Asia, and it's waiting for you in the aisle of a big box store, stacked next to the...
Everything the name once meant did not. So who killed Schwinn? It's tempting to blame Taiwan, or the Union, or one arrogant heir, but the truth is harder. Schwinn was killed by the very thing that created it: control. A family that would rather starve its factory than share its company. That would rather break its own workers than modernize. That handed its secrets to a rival rather than surrender a single seat in the boardroom. Every decision made sense in the moment. Together, they were suicide. The great factory on Chicago's west side is gone now. The workers who built the Phantoms and the Krates are grandparents and great-grandparents. But walk into almost any garage sale in America, and sooner or later you'll find one. A heavy old bicycle with a little brass badge on the front, still solid after 50 years. Built by people whose names nobody remembers, in a factory that no longer exists. And somewhere in every one of those garages is the ghost of a Chicago boardroom in 1963, and a welder standing in front of the men who ran the most powerful bicycle company on earth, holding a strange little bike with a banana seat. They laughed at it. It became the best-selling bicycle in American history. And the company that built it is gone, while the bicycle, indestructible, American, and utterly unmistakable, is still here. They really did build them to last. That was never the problem. The problem was everything else.